Okay, so you've probably moved through chapter 1 at this point and looking at chapter 2. And what I like to do here is just add some features on two of what I think the two most important settlements in chapter 2, Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay. And I feel very strongly about that. My goal, well, is basically to let you know why I feel that these two groups came to the Americas and what their importance was to the future of what would become the United States. And I know that this brief lecture will hit points in both chapters 2 and 3, but I'm hoping you'll forgive me in that it's about 90% confined to chapter 2. And in my next summary, I'll combine chapters probably 2 and 4, 2, 3, and 4, into what I call the old colonial period of America. And that's okay. You just concentrate on the individual chapters for your quizzes, and you let me worry about the broader themes that I feel apply towards your exams. But more on that next time. So what I'll do is I'll do an overall summary of the chapter and then get into the specifics of Jamestown and Massachusetts Bay. And probably what I'll do is I'll just do a two-part summary for chapter 2. One dealing with Jamestown and the other dealing with Massachusetts Bay, because I know you're not going to sit through both. So, okay, just a general summary to chapter 2, the challenge to Spain and settlements of North America. So we're looking at about, right after 1600, the French, the Dutch, English, they've established colonies in these new areas. Societies created by Europeans. They range from the lifestyle and economy that accompanied the fur trade of New France, as you'll read about, and New Netherlands, to the family farms of Puritan New England, to the tobacco-producing areas of Virginia and Maryland, to the very wealthy slave-dependent sugar islands of the Caribbean, and then to the mixed economies of the Restoration colonies. Now, the Protestant Reformation that began with Martin Luther and John Calvin increased differences amongst the peoples and added a very powerful religious factor to these settlements in some areas. And, of course, the early French Empire experimented very briefly with religious toleration. The Dutch introduced religious pluralism to North America. And there was even some toleration in early Maryland and basically indifference in Virginia and the Caribbean. So yeah, religion played a very important role in many of these settlements, especially up in New England, where theological concerns were urgent matters to these Puritans. And these concerns colored the way of life and helped produce several new colonies. Probably won't get to it in this summary. It'll be the next summary when we're dealing with what I call the old colonial system. But you'll be reading about chapter 2, where 6 colonies were founded after something known as the Restoration of the monarchy in 1660, extending from acquisition of land, extending from New York to Carolinas, which the reason that they delineated after 1660 is because these were all deliberately planned. Much more efficiently than these first colonies. So, in any event, that's a general overview of some of the materials you'll be looking at in Chapter 2. There's quite a big topic spread here. But again, I want to concentrate just on 2 particular colonies that hopefully will, if we kind of look at them in depth, you'll get a real solid understanding of what's going on in Chapter 2 and what's going on in this time period in the colonies. And so here we go. Let's talk about Virginia, the settlement of Virginia, which roughly coincides to about 1607 to 1624. And in Chapter 2, you're going to see the creation of the first permanent colony in America, 1607, Jamestown. Now, Jamestown would have a representative form of self-government, a strong sense of individuality in that community. Yet Jamestown was not established to extend the British Empire or form a representative form of government. It was a private enterprise, a private business venture to make money. Capitalism came on these first ships. And when looking back on the makeup and development of this colony, it was very modern. Now, between 1558 and 1603, the English government under Elizabeth I was too preoccupied with her own concerns to attempt a concerted effort to colonize and settle the colonies. Therefore, private individuals came together to make this happen in a purely economic attempt to make some money, right? Now, as you've seen in chapter 2, Walter Raleigh attempted to colonize the New World, but he failed miserably. I mean, anybody ever heard of Roanoke, really? So the point is, it just was too expensive, too risky for one person to try and colonize alone. I mean, my goodness, Raleigh lost a fortune on the failure of the Roanoke colony. But the importance here is this. While the capability to settle with one person was found to be just a pipe dream, the capability to settle in an area of the New World was a great opportunity, maybe, if it was done right. So it suggested to entrepreneurs back in England that an opportunity to make some money was there if they worked collaboratively together. And as you'll see in your text, they come together and they form something called joint stock companies, right? Basically small corporations, okay? So you're going to read about King James chartering several of these joint stock companies in the New World. And these joint stock companies, these small corporations, were guaranteed a monopoly on whatever particular business they were involved in, timber, fishing, whatever. And they had objectives. I mean, their first objective obviously was to make some money, get a return on their investment. And secondly, it would be, of course, an English colony. And it was, my friends, these types of companies that settled the New World. Obviously, it settled Jamestown in 1607. So Jamestown gets started, but it didn't get started out too well. I mean, by 1608, there was a lot of conflict and fighting between the settlers and the natives. And also, it must be remembered that these settlers here at this time were not individuals who were professionals and skilled laborers. They were adventurers. And that caused a lot of problems for the company, since these men were unwilling to do the day-to-day tasks necessary for the settlement's ultimate survival. So a leader was needed, John Smith. Now, I'll let your textbook do the due diligence on Smith and his importance to leadership in the early days of Jamestown. So your text does a decent job walking you through those first years in Jamestown, but my friends, I cannot emphasize the despair these individuals felt at times due to disease, attacks, and lack of food during the winter. For example, the winter of 1609-10, sometimes referred to as the starving time, found that out of 490 people, only about 60 people survived. These people were desperate. Food was so scarce that some colonists resorted to cannibalism. And the only reason this settlement made it, and this is important, was due to the joint stock companies never giving up on their investment. They continued to resupply the colonists. Again, without continued support from investors, who, by the way, were not receiving any money at this point, this settlement would have failed miserably. Now, as to the principal moneymaker in Virginia, your textbook does a good job talking about the agricultural products like tobacco. And they're making a lot of money off of it, hopefully, with time. Now, these joint stock companies that were in charge of the colony at Jamestown will go through a lot of revisions to their original charter in attempts to encourage settlement in the colonies, as well as to make money for their investors. The point being that as time went on, more and more power found its way to the local level, away from England. Now, it's not really defined well in your textbook, and I'm not going to quiz you on this, but what happened, guys, when Jamestown started in 1607, all the power was in the hands of a few men back in London, England, in terms of who ran the company, who ran the colony, etc. And through revisions to their charter, the lifeblood of their organization, right, which set the rules and regulations of what they could and couldn't do on this charter, right? Over time, through revisions of that charter, more and more power was given to the people in the actual colony. Now, they weren't doing that to be nice. They weren't doing that to, hey, let's give these people more freedom, liberty. No, none of that. They're doing it because they want this colony to be successful, to make money. They're doing it to try to find ways to make people there happy, so more people will move there, to make it more efficient, to make the money. So don't get misguided on the motivations of people back in England. So, for example, one of those revisions that was key, very important revision, was in 1619, when the Joint Stock Company instructed people in Virginia to create a governing body. It was called the General Assembly. Now, this governing body was composed of an upper house, called the General Assembly, and a lower house, termed the House of Burgesses, as mentioned in your textbook. The assembly members were chosen, appointed by the council, and were taken from the more successful ranks of landowners. The burgesses were composed of adult white males with no servants or indentured servants. Now, the governor met when this body convened, and they all met to make law, but the governor or the company could veto anything at any time. Now, this institution was not democratic, but it was representative of some people. Okay? So these reforms and changes that the company tried to institute in Jamestown, they worked in a way. Settlers were attracted, but it didn't do anything to save the company. The joint stock company by the 1620s was basically about to fail. It wasn't making any money for its investors, which is not a good thing if you're a company that's been in business for 15 years. And there was a lot of discontent from people in Virginia. It was not easy to live there. There was a lot of death. The company was seen as not doing enough to protect its settlers from the natives. For example, the Indian Massacre of 1622, also known as the Jamestown Massacre. It occurred in the Virginia colony on March 22nd of 1622, where the Algonquins killed about 347 settlers in all, men, women, and children, in the initial attack. And then in the following winter, due to the destruction of crops during the attack, more than 400 more settlers died due to malnutrition and disease. And of course, they were angry at the natives, and they waged a war of extermination the following spring that basically wiped out every tribe on the coastal area, but they blamed the company for not doing enough to protect them. And then on top of everything else, the company got into an argument with the King of England. And it may sound boring, and to some of you it probably is, but this is so important in terms of how things played out later for Jamestown and the colonies, this argument. But what basically happened was the king wanted the company to sell him all the tobacco from Virginia at cost so he could turn around, resell it, and make a nice, tidy profit. Our company refused. And in 1624, the king brought a legal action against the company, which resulted in their charter being revoked. Virginia now was a royal colony. The company is over. Now, the stockholders got to keep what land they had gotten out of Virginia. That's about it. Didn't make that much difference to the settlers living there, though. I mean, whether they were working for the company or whether the settlers were working for the royal person, in their eyes, not much had changed, right? It was either white elites that owned a company that ran them, or the single white elite, the king, that was running it. They got to keep their General Assembly. The point being that the same class of people were in control. So Virginia continued to rely on land as a source of the prosperity and life. In 1619, they also began to rely on slaves. Ironically, that's the same year they received their ability to self-govern. So Virginia then was not a success as a capitalist venture, which of course had been the investors' primary motivation. Yet as a foothold for England, the secondary influence for settlement, it was a success. As seen, hopefully you'll get this out of the textbook, as seen in the example of self-government reforms taken by the joint stock companies, Virginia was very modern. It was very modern in its ability for government to link with private enterprise. And hopefully you'll see it was also an agency for self-government, first within the company and then amongst the settlers. Look, I point all this out simply to lay the case that many of the issues you were familiar with during the pre-revolutionary period were being laid out over 100 years prior here in Jamestown. I mean, although it was a royal colony, Virginia basically was left to her own devices. Because she's so far away. Think about it. London and Jamestown. It's a long way off. Okay? That's not hard to understand. And the king and parliament's not interested in running the day-to-day affairs from London of Jamestown. And I think you'll see that in the next couple of chapters as these colonists got used to being left alone. Okay, so please pay attention to the development of Jamestown and how that worked out. Okay, so I'm going to stop there now. I'll post a separate summary talk about the Puritan colony of Massachusetts Bay that applies to Chapter 2.